After what felt like a long British winter, and feeling the urge for another adventure, in February 2019, I decided to book just over a week off work and went cycling up through Spain, from Seville to Bilbao, vaguely following some of La Via de la Plata, one of the many Camino de Santiago routes. Once I had arrived in Seville, and after accidentally planning my route through a top security defence HQ, I tried to get out of the city and into the countryside as soon as possible, seeing my first glimpse of orange trees. After a noisy night, camping just hidden off the main road, I packed up early and left just after the sun had risen. The roads were smooth and empty, with long, steady climbs going up through a national park. Even though my legs weren't used to the hills, the climbing was all worth it, with beautiful views and long descents going down the other side. I always find the first day of trips interesting, partly still thinking about what I've left behind, but enjoying the freedom of the road and seeing the new landscapes change before me. So far, I was loving the area, and glad I had chosen this region to cycle through, even without much research beforehand. With the sun starting to set, and my body still aching from the previous night's poor sleep, I headed into a cheap hotel, and called it a night. After being kept awake until 4 o'clock in the morning, listening to the noisy neighbours and Spanish conversations, I headed out of the town which I had stayed in. Passing through the olive groves, I made the most of the flat roads after a delayed start, having trouble paying with my currency card, made worse with my extremely bad Spanish. During the day, the weather was perfect for cycling. With no clouds in the sky, it was much needed after a wet and cold British winter. Going through another nature reserve, I witnessed a great sunset, looking across the plain, and was surprised to find a campsite which was actually open, even having the luxury of free hot showers. With a beautiful sunrise, I headed off on a mix of gravel trails and roads, and began climbing, where extraordinary views were waiting for me at the top. Cycling over 100 miles a day, I love seeing all the changes that happen before my eyes, both in the landscape, but also in the culture and the communities who live there. I had planned to wild camp, but being low on food and water, I headed to Salamanca and found a campsite. Being February, I had the luxury of having the whole campsite to myself, and here I refueled with a standard noodles and pesto, while looking longingly at the 5-star hotel just opposite. To my surprise, and also discomfort, I woke up to find my tent had been covered in frost, and spent the next few hours on the bike trying to regain the feeling in my toes. As I was ahead of my schedule, and wanted to tick another country off my list, I made a 60-mile detour into Portugal. The blossom, the landscape, and rivers all made the extra distance worth it. As I crossed the border, I had long forgotten about the cold morning, enjoying what felt like 30-degree heat. Being the longest day so far, my legs were beginning to tire, and I headed into Zamora, finding a cheap hostel to avoid another frosty night. Apart from a few off-road and rocky sections, today was much easier compared to yesterday, with long, smooth roads, as well as a few canal paths which were used for the lesser-known Camino way. In Palencia, I found another cheap hostel to stay in, although soon found all of the rooms had strong smells of smoking and cigarettes. It was another cold morning, and I spent the first few hours on the bike, debating with myself whether I preferred to sleep in a warm but tobacco-smelling hostel or in my tent, freezing but in the fresh air. This debate in my head distracted me from my maps, and I soon found myself on a busy dual carriageway. I had to replan my route, and the only option was to head for the hills. This was one of the best decisions, passing through stunning scenery and climbing up and up. The sun was just setting as I started to descend the climb, with fresh, cold air streaming past me. Being the last full day on the bike, I wanted to challenge myself and see how far I could cycle. I left around 6 in the morning, having 2 very cold hours on the bike before the sun rose. With a strong headwind and a few long climbs with snow lining the road, I began to see more habitation and more people. After 150 miles, and my legs tiring, I was relieved when I arrived into Bilbao, just before nightfall. It was a weird feeling, waking up in a busy city, knowing that I had nowhere to cycle to, and that I had completed my adventure of cycling up through Spain. After cycling solo for over a week, I wasn't used to all the hustle and bustle and people, so I headed out for one final cycle to the coast. The bike, without any luggage on, felt much faster, lighter and nimble. This trip challenged me, both mentally and physically, but through it I learnt so much and found it thoroughly inspirational. After finding a bike box from a local bike shop, I packed up my bike and all my luggage and was soon on my way back home.